fifth grade. This video is for April 15th. Yesterday we began reading chapter 13, the Civil War, and we looked at the differences between the North and the South before the Civil War. Many of those differences had to do with the fact that people in the North did not own slaves because they had small farms and factories, and people in the South did have slaves because they had large plantations where they grew cotton and tobacco. So today we're going to look at a system that helped slaves escape from the South. At the end of page 206 that you read yesterday, it said, if slaves ran away from their owners in the South, there were some Northerners who were willing to help them get to freedom. This group was called the Underground Railroad. And not everyone who was against slavery belonged to the Underground Railroad, but there were many people who were part of this group, this organization that helped slaves escape. People who were against slavery were known as abolitionists. They wanted to abolish or do away with slavery. And the Underground Railroad was not underground and it wasn't a railroad. But underground in this sense meant secret. So it was a secret route that the slaves could use to escape. There were many different secret escape routes. And it was a railroad just because it was like a chain of different stops along these routes where the slaves could hide for a time before they moved on to their next destination. So it wasn't underground and it wasn't a railroad. There were no train tracks or railroad cars or anything, but it was a system of escapes routes for these slaves to travel on. And so if a slave was able to escape in the South, they always wanted to head north to one of the northern states so that they could be free there because there was no slavery in the North. But after a while, that wasn't even good enough just to get to a northern state because they could be captured and they could be sent back to the plantation that they had escaped from or to the southern state that they had escaped from. So the people who tried to help the slaves get from one of the safe houses or one of the places of hiding to the next were called conductors, and they were the people that guided the slaves. So if you travel on a train, the conductor's there is taking your ticket and helping you know where the next stop is going to be and things. And so that's what they were called on the Underground Railroad. The stations were the hiding places where the runaway slaves would stay. And they could be homes or they could be churches or even schoolhouses where the escaped slaves were welcomed in and kept safely in hiding till they could move on to the next station. And so, as I mentioned, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was a law that said if a slave escaped and they made it to a free state and they were captured, they could be sent back to their original southern state or state where they were held in slavery. So because of that, many slaves, when they escaped, went all the way north into Canada so that they would not run the risk of being captured and being sent back. One famous member of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. She herself was an escaped slave, and she went back many times to the plantation where she was from and then other plantations as well to help slaves escape and get to freedom. And so what you're going to do today is you are going to get to start on a little project that I have for you. And if you go to the Google Classroom and you find the worksheets that we have for you there, you'll find a worksheet that says Quilt Clues. And one of the things that the members of the Underground Railroad used to use to help signal the slaves were quilts hanging on a clothesline. So you know, a quilt is a blanket that people sometimes make, and they have different patterns and things on them. And of course, in those days, way back during this time in the early to mid 1800s, people didn't have washing machines and they didn't have dryers like we have today. So you would wash your clothes and then you would hang them out on the line to dry. Well, the members of the Underground Railroad would use quilts as signals to the escaped slaves because they would hang them out on the line to dry, and it looked perfectly normal. It didn't arouse any suspicions. And the patterns on the quilt would actually communicate to the slaves different messages. So on this worksheet, you're going to see at the top an explanation of that. It says quilts were used to signal fugitives as they traveled the Underground Railroad because it was not unusual for a quilt to be hanging outside on a clothesline to dry. The quilts hung near stations on the Underground Railroads were quite unique, however, because the patterns in the squares contained clues for the fugitive slaves to follow. Look below to learn some of the most popular codes. Then choose a pattern to draw or paint on a separate piece of paper. So there are 6 different patterns on this worksheet, and each pattern has a name and an explanation of what that pattern would communicate to the runaway slaves. For example, this first one is called Monkey Wrench, and it says this code signaled slaves to gather their belongings and prepare for the journey. So if a slave was able to see this, maybe hanging on a clothesline not far from where they lived, they would know, oh, okay, this is a good time of year. They always wanted to start in the spring when it was just beginning to warm up. That was a good time for them to try to escape. It would have been really dangerous for them in the winter because they couldn't take many provisions with them. They wouldn't have warm clothes and things like that. So in the spring is when they would usually try to start their journey. And so each of these communicates something different. And what you're going to do is you're going to make your own quilt patterns using these examples. And I just want you to use whatever you have at home. If you have just regular printer paper, that's fine. If you have some notebook paper, that's fine too. Excuse me, whatever you would like to use. And I'd like you to draw and color one of these quilt squares. And if you want to do more than one, that's fine too. If you want to take your paper and maybe fold it into 4ths, you can draw a different one in each of those 4 sections of the paper. It's totally up to you. You can use markers, you can use colored pencils, crayons, whatever you happen to have at home. And then I'd really like to see your finished product. So if you'd like, maybe your parents can take a picture and email it to me, or a picture of you holding it would be even better. I know that not too long ago in Art with Miss Faulkner, you did a project that was a quilt project. So if you want to kind of make it resemble something like what you did for that project, that's fine too. And you're going to have a few days to work on this, so take your time, do a nice job, and I can't wait to see what you come up with for your quilt. So in closing, I wanted to just share a verse with you from John 15:12. Jesus said, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." And these people who were members of the Underground Railroad were being loving and kind to these slaves who were able to escape as they were trying to help them get to freedom and have a better life. So at the end of this video, there's also a link to another video that I would like you to watch about the Underground Railroad.